June 27th, 1950. Zhongnanhai, Beijing. Mao Zedong sat in his study, reading the urgent telegram from Moscow with growing concern. The news was unexpected and potentially catastrophic. President Harry Truman had announced that the United States would intervene militarily in Korea. American air and naval forces were already being deployed to support South Korea. Ground troops would follow. The Korean War, which had begun just 2 days earlier as a straightforward invasion by Kim Il-sung's North Korean forces, was about to become something far more complicated and dangerous. Mao lit a cigarette. He was a chain smoker, often going through several packs a day, and walked to the window overlooking the lake. China was barely a year old as a communist state. The civil war against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists had only ended in 1949, and the country was still recovering from decades of war and chaos. The last thing China needed was a major military confrontation with the United States, but now, with American forces intervening in Korea right on China's border, such a confrontation was becoming increasingly likely. The telegram from Stalin was characteristically vague, offering no clear guidance. The Soviet leader had encouraged Kim Il-sung to invade South Korea, apparently believing the Americans wouldn't intervene. Stalin had been wrong. Now the question was, what would China do? Would Mao send Chinese troops to help North Korea? Would he risk war with the United States before his own revolution had even consolidated power? Mao's secretary entered quietly. "Chairman, Premier Zhou is here, and Generals Peng Dehuai and Nie Rongzhen have arrived as requested." Mao nodded. "Send them in. We need to discuss this situation immediately." Zhou Enlai, China's Premier and Foreign Minister, was the first to enter. At 52, Zhou was elegant, sophisticated, a skilled diplomat who could navigate complex international situations. He had spent years in international communist circles and understood Western thinking better than most Chinese leaders. Behind him came Peng Dehuai, the tough, plain-spoken general who had been one of the most effective commanders in the Civil War, and Nie Rongzhen, the acting chief of the General Staff. "Comrades," Mao began without preamble, "you've all read the reports. The Americans are intervening in Korea. Truman has ordered air and naval forces to support the puppet regime in Seoul. He's also sent the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait, preventing us from liberating Taiwan. The Americans are directly threatening Chinese interests on 2 fronts. Zhou spoke carefully, measuring his words. "Chairman, the situation is very serious. The Americans claim they're acting under United Nations authority. The Security Council passed a resolution condemning North Korean aggression and calling for member states to assist South Korea. The Soviets boycotted the vote. They weren't present to veto it. So the resolution passed. Now the Americans have UN legitimacy for their intervention." Mao waved his hand dismissively. "UN legitimacy. The United Nations is a tool of American imperialism. This so-called Security Council resolution is just an excuse for American aggression. But the question before us is not whether the Americans have legitimacy. They don't. The question is, what do we do about it?" General Peng Dehuai spoke bluntly, as was his nature. "Chairman, we must consider the possibility of Chinese intervention. If the Americans defeat the North Korean forces and occupy the entire peninsula, we'll have American troops directly on our border. That's an unacceptable security threat. Better to fight them in Korea than to fight them in Manchuria." Nie Rongzhen was more cautious. "Comrade Chairman, we must also consider our capabilities. The People's Liberation Army is large but poorly equipped. We have infantry but very little armor, almost no air force, inadequate artillery. The Americans have overwhelming technological superiority. They have tanks, aircraft, naval power, atomic bombs. If we fight them, we'll be at a severe disadvantage." Mao stood and began pacing, a habit when his mind was working through complex problems. "Comrades, let me tell you what I think. First, the American intervention in Korea is not just about Korea. It's about China. The Americans want to contain the Chinese Revolution, to prevent us from taking our rightful place as a major power. They support Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. They oppose our admission to the United Nations. They maintain hostile military forces throughout Asia. Korea is just the latest example of American imperialism threatening our security. Second, Mao continued, we cannot simply stand by and allow the Americans to occupy Korea. If they defeat the North, they'll have military bases right on our border. They'll be able to threaten Manchuria, our industrial heartland. They'll embolden Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. They'll make it impossible for us to focus on domestic reconstruction and development. So from a strategic perspective, we have no choice but to oppose American intervention. But third, and here Mao paused for emphasis, we must be realistic about the risks and costs. War with America would be extraordinarily difficult. They have superior weapons, superior technology, control of the seas and air. If we intervene, we'll suffer heavy casualties. The war could drag on for years. It could delay our economic development. It could even threaten the survival of the revolution if it goes badly. Zhou Enlai interjected, Chairman, perhaps we should exhaust all diplomatic options first. We could issue warnings to the Americans through various channels. We could make it clear that China will not tolerate American forces near its border. We could give them opportunities to back down before we commit to military intervention. Mao nodded thoughtfully. Yes, we'll do that. Premier Zhou, I want you to prepare a diplomatic statement warning the Americans. Make it clear that China has security interests on the Korean Peninsula and will not stand idle if those interests are threatened. Don't explicitly threaten intervention. Leave that ambiguous. But make our position clear. Over the following weeks, as American and UN forces began arriving in Korea to reinforce the collapsing South Korean army, Mao convened multiple meetings to discuss China's options. The internal debates were intense, revealing deep divisions within the Chinese leadership. On July 7, 1950, Mao gathered the Politburo for an extended discussion. The military situation in Korea had deteriorated dramatically. North Korean forces, which had initially swept south with great success, were now facing serious American counterattacks. American air power was devastating. U.S. Marines had landed at Incheon, threatening to cut off the North Korean army. It was becoming clear that without outside help, North Korea would be defeated. Mao opened the meeting with a frank assessment. Comrades, we must face reality. The Americans are winning in Korea. Kim Il-sung's forces are being pushed back. If current trends continue, the entire Korean Peninsula will be under American control within weeks. We must decide, do we intervene or do we accept American domination of Korea? The debate that followed was heated. Some leaders argued for immediate intervention. General Peng Dehuai made the case forcefully. Chairman, every day we delay makes the situation worse. If we're going to fight, we should fight now, while the North Korean army still exists as a fighting force. If we wait until it's completely destroyed, we'll have to fight the Americans alone. Better to intervene now, when we have allies. But others were deeply skeptical. Lin Biao, one of China's most celebrated military commanders during the Civil War, argued against intervention. Chairman, I understand the strategic concerns, but we must be realistic about our capabilities. The People's Liberation Army is exhausted from years of civil war. Our soldiers need rest and training. Our logistics are inadequate. We have no air force to speak of. Fighting the Americans in Korea would be extremely costly, and I'm not confident we would win. Gao Gang, the party boss in Manchuria, had a different concern. If we send our best troops to Korea, what happens to domestic security? We still have bandits and remnants of nationalist forces throughout the country. We still face opposition in many areas. Sending hundreds of thousands of troops abroad could create opportunities for internal enemies. Mao listened to all these arguments, smoking continuously, occasionally interjecting questions or observations. Finally, he spoke. Comrades, I've heard your concerns, and many of them are valid. Yes, intervention would be costly. Yes, we're not fully prepared. Yes, there are risks. But consider the alternative. If we don't intervene, the Americans will occupy Korea. They'll have military bases on our border. They'll be able to threaten our security at any time. They'll use Korea as a launching pad for subversion and possibly invasion of China. How can we accept that? Moreover, Mao continued, warming to his theme, this is not just about military security. This is about the credibility of the Chinese Revolution. We claim to be the leaders of the Asian Revolution, the champions of national liberation. If we stand by and watch as the Americans crush a socialist neighbor, what does that say about our commitment to revolutionary principles? How can we call ourselves internationalists if we refuse to help our comrades when they need us most? Zhou Enlai proposed a middle course. Chairman, perhaps we should prepare for intervention while continuing diplomatic efforts. We can mobilize troops, position them near the Korean border, make our preparations visible to the Americans. This gives us the capability to intervene if necessary, while also serving as a deterrent. Maybe the Americans will reconsider their advance if they know we're ready to fight. This approach appealed to Mao. Yes, let's do that. Order the Northeast Border Defense Army to begin preparations immediately. Move our best troops to Manchuria. Stock supplies. Prepare for possible operations in Korea. And Premier Zhou, intensify our diplomatic warnings. Make sure the Americans understand that we're serious. On August 4th, 1950, Mao addressed a meeting of senior military commanders at Zhongnan High. His words revealed his thinking about the American intervention and China's response. Comrades, the American imperialists have shown their true face in Korea. They claim to be defending freedom and democracy, but what they're really defending is their right to dominate Asia. They cannot accept that the Asian people have risen up, that we've thrown off the chains of colonialism and imperialism. Korea's unification under a progressive government threatens American interests, so they intervene militarily. But the Americans have made a mistake. They think their technological superiority makes them invincible. They think we Chinese are afraid of their weapons. They're wrong. We've defeated enemies with superior weapons before. We defeated the Kuomintang, which had American equipment and American advisors. We'll defeat the Americans in Korea if necessary. However, Mao cautioned, we should not be reckless. War with America is not something to be undertaken lightly. We must prepare carefully. We must understand the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. We must be ready for a long, difficult struggle. The Americans are not the Kuomintang. They're a powerful enemy with vast resources, but they have weaknesses too. They're fighting far from home. Their soldiers don't understand what they're fighting for. They're politically divided. We can exploit these weaknesses. In September 1950, after MacArthur's brilliant Incheon landing turned the tide of the war decisively against North Korea, Mao's calculus changed. The North Korean army was collapsing. American and South Korean forces were driving north toward the Chinese border. The possibility that Mao had feared American troops on China's doorstep was becoming reality. On October 1st, 1950, exactly 1 year after the founding of the People's Republic, Mao convened an emergency Politburo meeting. The situation was now critical. South Korean troops had crossed the 38th parallel and were advancing north. American forces would follow soon. Kim Il-sung had sent desperate appeals for Chinese help. Mao's opening statement was stark. Comrades, the moment of decision has arrived. The Americans are not stopping at the 38th parallel. They're going to try to conquer all of Korea. If we don't intervene now, North Korea will be destroyed, and we'll have American troops all along our border from the Yellow Sea to Vladivostok. This is unacceptable. I believe we must intervene. The debate was intense. Lin Biao again argued against intervention, citing the risks and costs. Chairman, we're not ready for this war. Our forces are inadequate. The Americans have atomic bombs. What if they use them against us? What if the war expands beyond Korea? We could be destroyed. Mao's response revealed his strategic thinking. Comrade Lin Biao, I understand your concerns. Yes, the Americans have atomic bombs. But will they use them? I think not. If they use atomic weapons against China, the Soviet Union might retaliate. The Americans don't want world war. They want a limited war in Korea. We can fight that kind of war. As for our capabilities, Mao continued, yes, we lack modern weapons. But we have something the Americans don't have: revolutionary spirit, commitment to a cause, willingness to sacrifice. The Americans are fighting for imperialism, for the right to dominate others. Our soldiers will be fighting to defend the motherland, to protect the revolution. That moral superiority will compensate for their material advantages. Peng Dehuai supported intervention. Chairman, I agree we must fight, but we need Soviet support, air cover especially. Without air support, our forces will be extremely vulnerable to American aircraft. We should make Soviet air support a precondition for intervention. Zhou Enlai was dispatched to Moscow to negotiate with Stalin. The Soviet leader agreed to provide equipment and eventually air cover, though he proved less forthcoming than the Chinese had hoped. Nevertheless, on October 8, 1950, Mao made the final decision. China would intervene in Korea. That evening, Mao drafted the order to Peng Dehuai, who would command the Chinese forces in Korea. The American imperialists are extremely arrogant. They will not stop unless they receive a serious blow. To allow the American invasion of Korea to succeed would be harmful to the Chinese people, and we cannot sit idly by. We have decided to send volunteers to Korea to fight the invaders. Though this will involve great sacrifices, it is necessary. Tell our soldiers they are fighting not just for Korea, but for China, for peace, for the revolution. On October 19, 1950, Chinese volunteers, actually regular People's Liberation Army troops organized as the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, began crossing the Yalu River into Korea. The intervention would eventually involve nearly 3 million Chinese soldiers. The war would last 3 more years, cost hundreds of thousands of Chinese lives, and end in stalemate roughly where it had started, at the 38th parallel. But in those crucial months of June through October 1950, when America took control of the Korean War under UN auspices, Mao Zedong made a series of statements and decisions that revealed his strategic thinking. In a meeting with Soviet Ambassador N.V. Roshchin on August 20th, Mao had articulated his core concern. If the Americans occupy all of Korea and reach the Yalu River, we'll have no peace. They'll find excuses to invade China. Better to fight them now in Korea than later in China itself. To his own commanders, Mao was even more direct. In a September meeting, he said, "The Americans think we won't dare to fight them. They think we're afraid of their weapons and their economic power. But they don't understand the Chinese people. We've been fighting for survival for 100 years. We've defeated the Japanese. We've defeated the Kuomintang. We're not afraid of the Americans. If they want war, we'll give them war." And in private conversations with Zhou Enlai, Mao revealed his broader strategic vision. Premier Zhou, this war is not just about Korea. It's about whether China will be respected as a major power. If we fight the Americans and hold our own, the world will see that China has stood up, that we cannot be bullied. That's worth the cost. Mao's public statement announcing Chinese intervention, broadcast on October 24, 1950, after Chinese forces had already engaged American troops, summarized his position. The Chinese people will not tolerate foreign aggression on their doorstep. The American imperialists, by invading Korea and threatening our northeastern border, have forced us to act. The Chinese people love peace, but we are not afraid of war. We have defeated powerful enemies before. We will defeat American aggression now. The Chinese people's volunteers are fighting not for conquest but for security, not for aggression but for defense. We fight so that China can develop in peace. Years later, reflecting on the decision to intervene in Korea, Mao told visitors, "When America took control of the Korean War, they thought we wouldn't dare to oppose them. They underestimated the Chinese people's determination to defend our security. They thought their superior weapons would frighten us into submission. But we understood that if we didn't fight them in Korea, we'd eventually have to fight them in China itself. So we fought. We suffered greatly. My own son died in that war. But we proved that China could not be intimidated, that we would defend our interests regardless of the cost. That was the real victory." What Mao said when America took control of the Korean War revealed a leader willing to take enormous risks to establish China's credibility as a major power and to prevent American military forces from threatening China's borders. His statements mixed revolutionary rhetoric with hard-headed strategic calculation, moral conviction with pragmatic assessment of China's security needs. He understood the costs of intervention, but believed the costs of non-intervention would be even higher. Whether his decision was wise remains debated by historians, but there's no question it was consequential, establishing China as a major military power willing to challenge the United States, setting the pattern for Sino-American relations for decades, demonstrating that the era of Western domination of Asia was definitively over.